Recently, I talked about a mostly forgotten part of the game industry, middleware. What essentially were the B-movies of video games have now been almost entirely snuffed out by financial failure, the companies themselves being swallowed up by larger publishers. Respawn is a great example of that. Or exist in their own little bubble of, this may sound harsh, but essentially mediocrity through repetitive sequels or simply starting with a weaker foundation to begin with. Like most things in the gaming industry, middleware used to be better. It used to cover all of the gaps that were left out by AAA in the industry. And during the PS2 era, it flourished. There were countless licensed games of varying quality. Sure, most of them weren't great, but a few were shining examples of how you could accomplish something with a smaller budget than the absolute top of the scale $100 million development cycle. The company most famous for producing these AA games was THQ, which mainly released licensed games, but also had a few notable franchises of its own, like Destroy All Humans, Tak and the Power of Juju, and the subject of today's video, Darksiders. And Darksiders was one of THQ's very last games before they went bankrupt initially, from investing in a drawing tablet for the Wii, of all things. Very interesting story, I suggest you look into it. And I think it's only fitting that one of their last games is also one of their best. Darksiders is best known for being a sort of copycat franchise. It started off being essentially a hybrid of God of War and The Legend of Zelda, though it doesn't quite reach the heights of either franchise. But there's something very appealing about meshing two gameplay styles into something that sort of has a unique feel, and it also has its own unique characters and universe that allow it to stand apart from the competition. Now, before we get into this, I'd like to remind you all, do the things the algorithm likes. You all know what that means by now. Check out my Patreon if you want to support me financially. And without further ado, let's check out THQ's original swan song, Darksiders. Darksiders is bizarrely one of the least consistent franchises. Not necessarily in quality, but strangely enough in genre. While each of the first three games are a kind of action-adventure, hack-and-slash type of game, each sequel significantly changes mechanics and becomes a different subgenre. And if you ask me, the first is still the best. The splicing of Zelda-style dungeons and exploration elements with serviceable combat mechanics makes for a unique experience. While you can definitely make the argument that it's derivative, I don't see anything wrong with that because the game still has its own identity. The story and universe are very loosely based in Christianity. I mean, essentially they just took the idea of angels, demons, and the four horsemen of the apocalypse and just kind of did their own thing with it. And so the setting of this game is like a post-apocalyptic fantasy, but also modern setting. It's bizarre to see like these, huge, decrepit, dilapidated skyscrapers mixed in with essentially traditional fantasy dungeons. But it's one of the things that helps the game stand apart, and more than just a simple Zelda clone. Though since usually I cover combat mechanics first, I should talk about that because honestly, it's the worst part of the game. And I'd rather start off with positives, but I think you should know this going in, that easily the weakest part of Darksiders is the combat mechanics. Most modern hack and slash games follow a simple 2-button formula for combos, right? Light attack, heavy attack, punches, kicks, etc. You know the deal by now, right? Well, Darksiders has a 1-button combat system. Yeah, square. Square is all of your sword attacks. that in itself pretty much tells you how basic the combat is. And yeah, this combat is about as spammy as it gets. You have your sword slashes, you have dodges, you have wrath powers, which are essentially, your magic that you use every once in a while, right? And you can also use an alternative weapon with triangle, which is completely useless. Just like the original God of War games, the alternative weapons are pretty much useless. Seriously, don't use them at all. They're straight up weaker than the sword. I know, because to get every achievement in this game, you have to max out every weapon. All 3 of them, right? And the scythe and the gauntlet are absolutely useless. Do not use them at all. The sword covers every combat role it could possibly need to cover at once. And especially with one specific combo, which you can buy at the very beginning of the game if you save up enough souls. The whirlwind combo completely breaks the game. Essentially, all you have to do it is hit square, wait a second, then hit square again, right, to start this combo. And not only does it do twice as much damage as the standard square combo, but it also hits behind you as well. So it is great at crowd control, killing enemies faster. You can even turn around and still keep up the combo. It's honestly just ridiculous, but I'm glad that it's in the game because it makes the most repetitive part of said game, which are the forced combat sections. Because like God of War, they have these little parts of the game where they force you in a room, lock the doors, and you gotta kill everybody, right? And while the enemy variety in this game is passable, it's really not that bad. They definitely overuse the pickaxe enemies, like these blue demon dudes and later the orange demon guys with like bigger pickaxes or whatever. You fight way too many of them over the course of the game. And so the whirlwind combo makes the combat a lot less painful because you can get through it nearly twice as quickly. And really there's not much more to the combat than just spamming square. Because even though you can block and dodge, the dodge feels very sluggish. I mean, you can still time it right to dodge certain attacks that can't be blocked or countered, but you're gonna be spamming square as much as possible, especially if you play this game on normal, because this game is extremely easy on normal. Hard, on the other hand, is a lot more difficult at the beginning, but then also becomes a lot more easy once you get toward the middle of the game and you've already leveled up your sword. And if for some reason you ever feel like you're actually threatened in combat, you have your chaos form, which essentially you turn to this huge flaming demon, and you're completely invincible, and you do easily enough damage to wipe out any enemy that threatens you. So yeah, suffice to say, this is a easy game. There are also these abilities that you can attach to weapons, one for each weapon, and some of them even have passive abilities on them, so you should attach those to your other weapons that you never will use, ever. And once you've upped your damage, your armor, you're pretty much good to go for the rest of the game. I mean, if you're playing on normal, you can pretty much just spam square and barely ever dodge, and you're good to go. And of course, the game has a counter, which you unlock pretty early on, and once you upgrade this to level 3, it is ridiculous. Like, one counter knocks an enemy down to auto kill level, because another thing that Vigil games ripped from God of War are the cinematic finishing moves whenever an enemy is weak, which problem is there's only a handful of them and you're gonna do some of them over and over and over again. You get significantly less souls if you do the auto kill versus just killing them with sword slashes. But if you're just playing this game for the first time, that's probably not going to matter to you. So you're going to see the same animations over and over and over again. Another thing too that you can do in this game that's really cool is you can pick up environmental objects and throw them, which in itself, that doesn't sound revolutionary or really that crazy, but you can pick up cars and just fucking smack people with them. It is fun, man. And you could throw them like crazy far. You can throw a taxi cab like the length of a football field. I mean, it's not quite as effective damage-wise as you would hope, But you can still kill normal enemies just by throwing that shit into them. It's pretty fun. Later on in the game, there aren't quite as many objects to throw around, but it definitely keeps things interesting. If you don't feel like just spamming square over and over again, you can just fucking smack people with cars, toss light poles like they're spears, or even just grab chairs and tables and just smash people with them. It's kind of hilarious. So the last piece of the combat is the wrath powers, right? And this is another thing that just feels like it wasn't that well thought out, because the default wrath power, which summons these sword blades around you, is just unquestionably better than the rest. Because the other three are essentially buffs that slowly drain your magic, whereas the blades just take out one bar, right? And you can buff your damage resistance, your damage, you can be on fire, you can poison people around you. The problem is, why would you use any of that when a fully upgraded Blade Geyser literally kills any lesser enemy in one hit, and everybody around you? So if you ever get surrounded, boom, like everyone is either dead or heavily damaged, and it only ever costs 1 wrath bar. By the end of this game, you're gonna have like 8 wrath bars. So you could spam Blade Geyser if you want to just trivialize the combat. So yeah, I mean, the other wrath powers, I'm sure they're fine, but it's just not really worth the investment when you already have one that's so good. Now, of course, for games like these, half the combat is the enemies, right? Especially in Dark Souls, I would argue it's about 80% of the combat is the type of enemies you fight, right? And yeah, like I said earlier, Darksiders is pretty passable in this regard. Other than the pickaxe guys, there's actually a decent variety of enemies with different abilities that, if you had more combat moves, I'm sure would force you to be better at the game. Unfortunately, due to the simplicity of the combat, you're probably not going to play much differently even against these harder enemies, because they've got enemies that can block, they've got enemies that have attacks that can't be blocked, they've got flying enemies so that you have a reason to use air combos. There are enemies that can become temporarily invincible. There's, a lot of the type of stuff you would expect out of a God of War type game. So I'd say that part of it is fine. So the combat is definitely one part that they have improved with the sequels. Each sequel gets a little bit better with the combat, which is great. But the reason why Darksiders 1 is still the best is because of everything else that isn't the combat. See, the dungeons, the Zelda dungeons, are honestly one of the most fun parts of the game, because they're handled really well. Part of that is they make the most out of the setting. Like, the first dungeon is this huge cathedral, like, mansion type of place, right? And the basement is this massive complex that essentially looks like this medieval dungeon, covered in lava. But there's also this huge jailer dude who's like covered in these green boils, and he's a cool little like mid-dungeon boss. Of course, you gotta use your newly found gadget to take him out, because this is a Zelda clone after all. And there are all these weird growths everywhere that have to be blown up by these like fiery spike ball bombs and stuff. And of course, you get a boomerang, even more of a Zelda thing. I mean, it's like a chakram type of weapon, but it's basically a boomerang, right? And the boomerang can even be used in combat, though you're probably only going to use it against these poison meaty skeleton guys, because that's how you get the poison off of them. Otherwise, you take damage over time. But as you would expect, the game has fairly simple puzzles as well in these cool dungeons, and there's a boss at the end. And the bosses are nice because it combines like the sort of Zelda trope where you have to use the tool you got in the dungeon against the boss, but you can still slash said boss like with your normal combos. So they mix the boss concept of doing the same thing 3 times with also a phase where you just straight up have to fight the boss. It makes that very tired boss concept a lot more interesting. And the other dungeons are pretty cool as well. Like the second dungeon is in like a huge subway station, and it takes you through the tunnel system, and you have to like flood certain areas with water or drain the water and shit. Trust me, it's not nearly as bad as the water temple in any of the Zelda games. It's a lot more simple than that. And you also get this gauntlet that can break these huge crystal things. So the game sort of has like a Metroidvania element with that as well, where you return to previous areas with your new tools and you're like, oh look, a giant crystal thing I can break with this gauntlet I found. And even though it's pretty simple, I mean, it's still pretty fun. Especially, personally, I'm a fan of Metroidvanias. I played pretty much every Metroid game, except for the 2 remakes. And just having a little element in the game like this makes the world that much more fun, I guess. I don't know, it's hard to explain. Obviously, it's pretty subjective. But you can actually find some really cool stuff. Like, hidden across the world are these pieces of the Abyssal armor set, right? They're spread all throughout the game, and there's usually a piece in each dungeon as well. So, by the end of the game, when you get all 10 pieces, you get this really cool, like, black and silver armor set that just completely trivializes the game, by the way. Not only does it make you take, like, half damage from any attack, but you also have a permanent health vampire type effect, where, you know, you hit an enemy and you drain life from them. Which is funny because there's a weapon attachment that does that exact thing, and now you just have it permanently. And so, yeah, the game is extremely easy after you get the Abyssal armor set, no matter what difficulty you're on, but it's a great reward for exploring the entire world. Then there's all these artifacts that you can sell for souls. There's 4, like, legendary weapon attachments based on each of the horsemen that significantly boosts the power of your weapon. It's a lot of cool stuff, you know? And back to the dungeons, like the 3rd dungeon isn't even really a dungeon. And a refreshing change of pace, it's more like a linear action section, which you would think would be bad in a game like this since I complained about the combat earlier. But they throw in variety segments. Like, for example, you get your horse back finally, so you can have horse combat against these giant worms. And you have this huge automatic handgun that you have to shoot the worms' tongues with. There's also a section where you get this huge gun that shoots these explosive spikes, and so the game turns into like a third-person shooter for like 10 minutes. And despite being really simple, it's pretty fun. This is sort of a concept that's been retired, I think, from modern game design, but they used to throw in a lot of, like, I guess you could call them mini games into these higher budget games that would just be a fun little thing that you do like one time. And it just kept the game that much more interesting. And part of it is because it's a relic of linear game design. Now everything is boring-ass, repetitive sandbox. Another section like this in Darksiders is early on in the game, you ride a griffin, and it's an on-rail shooter, essentially. Like, you're flying through the air, and you gotta shoot all these dudes. And that's the only time you ever do that. And it's just like, yeah, that's fun, that's cool. And so it doesn't wear out its welcome, because you only do it one time. I'd say the only time that the game really gets obnoxious is the very last dungeon. You're in this huge tower, right? And of course, the new gadget you get is a portal gun. Yeah, of course. Right. It's not like Darksiders rips off enough games. And the portal gun puzzles are a fucking pain in the ass. They're not even hard. I mean, okay, maybe the one in... There's this huge room, right, where you gotta get to the top of the room. And there's all these, let's just call them what they are, they're basically scales. And you've got to use your portal gun to teleport the weights between the scales so that you can climb on top of the highest scale to ride it to the top when you remove the weight from it, right? The problem is this is a lot more easily said than done. Like, I'm sure there's a proper way to do it, but it's just so annoying, and I can't really explain it in a way that just shows off how annoying it is. You'll just know it when you play that part, but God, it was like, there's like 5 or 6 different portal puzzles in this dungeon, and not to mention, so you have to get to the top of these 3 towers, right? At the top of each tower is the same mini-boss that you have to fight the exact same way. All they do is cover up the portals in a different way, because you have to use a portal to teleport on top of his head and stab him, right? That's how you beat him. And yeah, all they do is like cover him up so he has to hit it with his mace. That barely changes the boss fight. It's the exact same fucking boss 3 times. And then the final boss of that area is this incredibly generic giant dude hanging over a platform boss design that I absolutely fucking hate. It is such a lazy, lazy boss design. It's like, okay, I know very, very few games have managed to pull this off, Metal Gear Rising being one of them, if you want to know how to pull off this type of boss design correctly.
Stop that blade!
But you can do giant enemies in games. You could pull off giant enemies. But instead of trying to make it work by like zooming out the camera or, well yeah, really it's just zooming out the camera. All you gotta do is zoom out the camera to have the giant boss fight you. Like in Dark Souls. Dark Souls 3 against Dark Eater Midir. That's a great example of how to do a giant dragon boss fight. But no, it's just a dude hanging over a platform. But honestly, it's weird because I just feel like the rest of the game is really good. It's just that the combat, and specifically that last dungeon, weigh down the experience significantly. One last thing too to mention is the interesting universe that they have here, right? Like I said earlier, loosely based on Christianity, you play as one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, War, voiced by Liam O'Brien, who most of you probably don't know, but I think he has a pretty great voice for this type of thing.
To hell with your claims! The seals were broken! I was summoned!
And Mark Hamill plays the Watcher, who's your little shadowy dude, and he's essentially doing the Joker voice from Batman the Animated Series. So that's a nice little touch there.
Let's lay down a few ground rules. Until this is over, you're a dog on a leash. I say bark, you bark. And if I have to kick you, you'd better not bare your teeth.
And this whole universe is essentially the design philosophy of Warhammer combined with like 90s Image or Dark Horse comics. And fittingly enough, Darksiders actually has a Dark Horse comic, so there you go. And so if you really like that over-the-top, kinda edgy, teenager style, this game has that to a T. There are some maybe slightly cringe moments where War tries to show off, you know, how badass he is.
Has prison made you a coward?
I played this game when I was 15 years old, and I love that shit, dude. And the story is actually decently interesting as well, because essentially the apocalypse started early, right? And no one can figure out why it happened. And one of the main angel generals gets killed. War gets like significantly weakened by the council in the prologue section. And so now they task him with killing everybody involved, basically, to clear his name, because they think he broke the final seal, which he did not. So yeah, I mean, you're essentially on a journey to take down the four chosen and then confront the destroyer himself, whoever he is. And you can kind of guess who the destroyer is just based on the few characters who are actually introduced. But even then, I don't know, I still think it's a fairly compelling story. And it has some cool side characters as well. Samael is this badass demon dude. He's essentially Satan's right-hand man.
Careful, or your ending will be a tragic one. Sometimes the hero dies in the end. But Horseman, I like stories that have a happy ending.
Volgrim is your typical shady merchant character who sells you all of your abilities and some upgrades.
You wound me, Horseman. I would never come between you and your friend Samael. No, I only wish to look at the heart. One glance, and our bargain is sealed.
And Ulthane is like this fucking just huge dude. Absolute peak performance, wide as he is tall, but still fucking giant. He's like a 10-foot tall dwarf, as much of a contradiction as it sounds like.
You know me, but I don't know you. And I don't like strangers. especially the uninvited kind.
And so, I guess to wrap this up, Darksiders is far from a perfect game. The combat alone will probably put off a lot of people because it just gets repetitive after a while. Because there's very little skill ceiling, and there's far too few moves for you to use, and even less reason to use anything that's not the whirlwind combo. But the Zelda dungeons keep it interesting all the way through, at least for me. And this might not sound like much of a compliment, but I think it's the second best non-Zelda Zelda game. The first best being Okami, and I'm sure I'll talk about that someday on this channel. And on a tangentially related note, THQ Nordic came back from the dead a few years ago, and they released Darksiders 3, and more recently Darksiders Genesis. And they've also remade a lot of their most popular games, like I reviewed SpongeBob Battle for Bikini Bottom remake, and they also remade Destroy All Humans. So it looks like middleware may be slowly coming back from the dead. I still think the quality of a lot of these other developers' games leaves much to be desired, but maybe THQ can lead the way, and maybe prove to some of these AAA developers that you don't need a $100 million budget to make money.
I offer you this choice, Horseman. Would you serve in heaven or rule in hell?
I choose what once a coward did not.
Hey guys, I got my 10 seconds of fame in that Crowcat video. If you hadn't seen my post or some of these other lovely commenters pointing it out, I was in that Cyberpunk video at the 15-minute, 20-second mark. If you want to hear my voice for 10 seconds, I guess, in that video. Honestly, it's great. I mean, I've been a fan of Crowcat for a really long time, honestly, so it's pretty cool that not only is he back when we needed him most, as some people have said in the comments, but also, I don't know, you know, I never thought I would be in a famous-ish YouTuber's video. At least not in, like, a positive way. I imagine I may be wrapped in controversy at some point, but as for channel stuff, thank you to all my patrons. You know I haven't said that yet, even though basically every YouTuber does that. My bad. Whoops. But seriously though, you guys really help out. I mean, as I've said a couple times before, I'm unemployed, and I don't make any money off of YouTube, really. Alright, well, this month I'll be making some money off of that Cyberpunk video specifically. But, yeah, no, it's not consistent at all. Ad money's in the toilet. But enough about that. As for other channel stuff, probably going to do the top 5 best and worst of 2020 video up next. Then Resident Evil 5. Then I think Rage 2. And then I think I'm probably going to cover The Witcher 1, of all things. So, I guess look forward to that. Maybe I'll throw up a channel poll in a couple weeks, see just what you guys would be interested in seeing. I'm still going to make those other videos that I put up on the poll at some point. My interest just kind of, you know, it fluctuates. You know, nothing holds my attention that long, but I swear I'll get back to them. Other than that, you know, I'll see you next time, guys.